she still loves you, man. I can't compete with what we had at camp. The text message appeared on my phone screen at exactly 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening while Savannah and I were curled up on our sectional couch in our suburban Austin apartment, halfway through some forgettable romantic comedy she'd chosen from Netflix. I was a 31-year-old petroleum engineer with a steady job at one of the major refineries outside the city, the kind of guy who believed in building something solid and real with someone, and I thought that's exactly what Savannah and I had been doing for the past 2 years. The unknown number belonged to Derek, a name I recognized from occasional stories about her past, though she'd always described him as ancient history from her college days and some summer camp job they'd both worked years ago. But this wasn't ancient history. Derek was drunk somewhere, pouring out his feelings about promise rings and shared memories and how Savannah had supposedly never gotten over what they'd had together at that camp, how he'd been trying to move on but couldn't stop thinking about the connection they'd shared, and how he knew she felt the same way even though she was with me now. I read the message 3 times, feeling this strange disconnect between the Netflix laugh track playing in the background and the words on my screen that seemed to be describing a completely different version of my girlfriend than the one sitting next to me. When I silently handed Savannah my phone, I watched her face transform in real time, first confusion as she read the sender's name, then recognition as she processed the message content, then something that looked like guilty panic mixed with resignation, as if she'd been waiting for this moment and dreading it simultaneously. What struck me most was that she didn't immediately react the way someone innocent would. There was no outrage, no immediate denial, no laughter about a crazy ex trying to sabotage her relationship. Instead, she sat there staring at my phone for what felt like an eternity before looking up at me with those 3 words that shattered everything I thought I knew about us: "It's complicated." Complicated wasn't the response of someone who'd cleanly ended a relationship and moved on. Complicated was the response of someone who'd been maintaining emotional connections while pretending to be fully committed to building something exclusive with me. I felt this cold clarity wash over me as I realized that Derek wasn't some delusional ex making up fantasies. He was someone who had recent, ongoing reasons to believe Savannah still had feelings for him, which meant my entire relationship had been built on a foundation of emotional dishonesty I'd been too trusting to recognize. I stood up from our couch without saying another word and walked directly to our shared bedroom, not to have some explosive confrontation or dramatic argument, but to begin the methodical process of investigating exactly what I'd been blind to, approaching it with the same systematic analytical skills I used every day in petroleum extraction and refinery operations. I started with her jewelry box, the small wooden case she kept on our dresser that I'd respected as her private space for 2 years, and buried beneath her everyday earrings and necklaces I found exactly what Derek had referenced: a delicate promise ring with a small stone that I'd never seen her wear, still carefully wrapped in tissue paper and polished to perfection. Clearly something she treasured enough to preserve but kept hidden enough to maintain plausible deniability about its significance. The discovery of that ring felt like confirmation of everything I'd been too naive to see. This wasn't just some old memento she'd forgotten about, it was a carefully preserved symbol of a connection she'd never actually severed, hidden away like evidence of a crime she hoped would never be discovered. With growing dread, I opened her laptop and began scrolling through months of social media interactions with Derek that had been happening parallel to our entire relationship, messages that were just innocent enough to pass casual scrutiny but frequent enough to maintain an emotional connection, conversations about shared memories from their summer camp days, inside jokes about experiences they'd had together, and the kind of consistent low-level flirtation and emotional intimacy that keeps doors open for future possibilities while providing enough ambiguity to deny any wrongdoing. As I systematically began packing her clothes into the matching luggage set we'd bought together for a vacation last spring, Savannah stood in our bedroom doorway, alternating between attempting to explain the complexity of her feelings and asking me to slow down and discuss this rationally like mature adults who could work through complicated situations together. I wasn't responding with the explosive anger she seemed to expect and maybe even wanted. Instead, I was calmly and methodically removing someone from my life who had been keeping backup relationship options while pretending to build something exclusive and committed with me. Every piece of clothing I folded and placed in her suitcase represented a small betrayal I hadn't recognized. Every hidden communication I'd discovered made me understand how naive I'd been about the relationship I thought we shared, and every attempt she made to explain or rationalize her behavior only confirmed that I'd been dating someone who fundamentally didn't understand the meaning of exclusive commitment. The worst part wasn't even the deception itself. It was realizing how many small moments over the past 2 years suddenly made sense with this new context, how many times she'd been distracted or secretive with her phone, how many conversations we'd had about the future that she'd navigated with careful ambiguity, keeping her options open while I'd been making concrete plans that assumed she was as invested in our relationship as I was. By 1 a.m., I had systematically documented everything I needed to understand the full scope of her emotional infidelity, taking screenshots of conversations and noting patterns of communication that painted a clear picture of someone who had never fully committed to our relationship, and by 2 a.m., I was calmly loading her belongings into her Honda Civic while she alternated between tears and promises to cut contact with Derek completely if I would just give her another chance to prove that her commitment to our relationship was real this time, though we both knew that ship had already sailed the moment she'd admitted that her feelings for him were complicated rather than definitively resolved. When I finally asked Savannah point-blank whether she was still in love with Derek, the question hung in the air of our apartment like a challenge she couldn't deflect with her usual charm and evasiveness. I had her laptop open on our kitchen table, showing months of conversations that painted a picture of ongoing emotional intimacy, and her promise ring sitting next to it like evidence in a courtroom, and I needed to hear her actually say what we both already knew was true. She broke down completely then, not with the manipulative tears she'd been using to try to change my mind, but with the kind of raw, honest crying that comes from someone who's been caught in a web of their own making and finally realizes there's no way to spin their way out of it. She admitted that she'd never stopped loving Derek, that she'd been confused about her feelings throughout our entire relationship, and that part of her had always been waiting to see if he would come back and fight for what they'd had at summer camp years ago. The confession felt like validation of everything I'd suspected once I started paying attention to the details she'd been hiding, but it also felt like a gut punch because it meant our entire 2-year relationship had been built on a foundation of her emotional unavailability that I'd been too trusting to recognize. I listened to her explain how she'd genuinely tried to move on and build something real with me, but that Derek had always represented this idealized version of first love that she couldn't shake, and I found myself feeling almost sorry for her trapped between competing loyalties until I remembered that she'd made the choice to maintain both connections instead of choosing one definitively. The way she described her feelings for Derek versus her feelings for me was particularly revealing. She talked about him with this dreamy nostalgia, describing their connection as something magical and irreplaceable, while she described me as stable and safe and reliable, the kind of man who would make a good husband someday but who didn't set her soul on fire the way Derek had. It was brutal honesty wrapped in language that was supposed to soften the blow, but I could hear exactly what she was really saying, that I'd been her practical choice while Derek remained her passionate one, and that she'd been keeping me around as emotional and financial security while maintaining the fantasy that Derek might eventually choose her as more than a backup plan himself. While she was still crying and trying to explain the complexity of her situation, attempting to make me understand that her feelings for both of us were real even though they were different, I was already moving to the next phase of my plan, which involved making sure everyone in both of our lives understood exactly what had happened before she could control the narrative or paint herself as the victim of my unreasonable jealousy and inability to understand modern relationships. I called her landlord first, a practical move since she'd been essentially living with me for 8 months but still maintained her own apartment across town that her fitness trainer's salary barely covered, and I calmly explained that she'd be moving back in immediately and would need the utilities turned back on that she'd had suspended to save money. The landlord, Mrs. Rodriguez, was understanding but unsurprised. Apparently Savannah had been behind on rent multiple times and had only stayed current because I'd been covering her shortfalls without realizing how financially precarious her situation actually was. Next, I called both sets of parents, starting with mine to give them a heads up that the relationship was ending and why, then calling her parents to explain the situation from my perspective before she could call them with some version that made me the villain for not understanding the nuanced complexity of emotional connections or being too rigid in my expectations of exclusive commitment. I reached her father first, a straightforward man who'd always treated me with respect and appreciation for how I'd supported Savannah's career ambitions and helped her with car payments and other expenses she couldn't handle on her trainer's income. I explained about Derek's text, about the promise ring, about the months of hidden communications, and about her admission that she'd never stopped being in love with him, and I could hear the disappointment in his voice as he processed what I was telling him about his daughter's behavior and what it revealed about the kind of person she'd become. Her mother was harder to reach, but when I finally got through I gave her the same factual account, emphasizing that I wasn't calling to badmouth Savannah but to make sure they understood why she'd be coming home upset and probably spinning a story about my unreasonable expectations or inability to handle the complexity of adult relationships where people can have feelings for multiple people simultaneously. The conversation with her sister Emma was particularly important because Emma had always been Savannah's closest confidant and biggest supporter, and I knew she'd be the first person Savannah would call for sympathy and strategic advice on how to win me back or at least salvage her reputation in our mutual social circle. I reached Emma at her apartment in downtown Austin and methodically walked her through everything I'd discovered, from Derek's drunk confession to the hidden promise ring to the months of secret communications that showed ongoing emotional intimacy and future planning. And I could hear her growing frustration as she realized her sister had been living a double life that made everyone who cared about her look naive and gullible. Emma admitted that she'd always wondered why Savannah seemed distracted in our relationship and why she talked about me more like a roommate than a boyfriend when we weren't around, but that she'd attributed it to Savannah's independent nature rather than emotional unavailability or divided loyalties. I finished by sending Emma screenshots of some of the more damning conversations between Savannah and Derek, the ones that showed clear emotional intimacy and discussions about what might happen if he ever moved back to Texas, because I wanted her to understand that this wasn't about me being possessive or unable to handle Savannah having male friends. This was about emotional infidelity that had been going on parallel to our entire relationship, undermining the foundation of trust that any healthy partnership requires. The final call was to Savannah's best friend Kayla, the one person who would definitely rally to her defense regardless of the evidence, and I approached that conversation knowing it would be more adversarial but wanting to establish my version of events before Kayla could be completely poisoned against me with some narrative about emotional abuse or unrealistic expectations. I explained the situation factually and sent her the same screenshots I'd sent Emma, emphasizing that I wasn't trying to destroy Savannah's reputation but that I needed people to understand why I was ending things so definitively without room for negotiation or second chances or attempts to work through our differences with couples counseling. Kayla was initially defensive and accusatory, suggesting that all relationships have complications and that I was being unreasonably rigid in my expectations, but I could hear her tone change as I walked her through the timeline of deception and the evidence of ongoing emotional infidelity that had made our entire relationship a lie built on false premises. By dawn, Savannah was loading the last of her belongings into her car while I stood in our doorway making sure she hadn't forgotten anything that would give her an excuse to come back, and I watched her drive away knowing that her entire support network now understood exactly what kind of person she'd revealed herself to be when she thought she could maintain backup relationships without consequences, and that any attempt to paint me as the villain would have to contend with the documented evidence of her systematic deception. The backlash from Savannah's family started within 48 hours, beginning with her sister Emma showing up at the petroleum refinery where I worked, demanding to speak with me during my lunch break about giving Savannah another chance to prove herself. Emma had always been protective of her younger sister, and despite the evidence I'd shown her, she'd apparently decided that my response was too harsh and final for what she characterized as a mistake born from confusion rather than malicious intent. She found me in the employee parking lot outside the main facility, looking frazzled and desperate in a way that told me Savannah had been working on her relentlessly since leaving our apartment, probably painting herself as the victim of my unreasonable standards and inability to forgive human weakness. Emma explained that Savannah had been crying nonstop, that she'd thrown away the promise ring and blocked Derek on all social media platforms, and that she was prepared to do whatever it took to rebuild the trust she damaged through her poor judgment and emotional immaturity. I listened patiently while Emma made her case, emphasizing how much Savannah loved me and how devastated she was to lose someone who'd been so good to her, but I could see that Emma didn't really understand the fundamental issue. This wasn't about Derek specifically, it was about Savannah's capacity for deception and her willingness to maintain backup relationships while pretending to be fully committed to building something exclusive with me. 2 days later, Kayla appeared at my gym in suburban Austin during my evening workout, approaching me while I was on the treadmill with the kind of aggressive determination that suggested she'd been planning this confrontation for hours. She was more direct than Emma had been, telling me that I was throwing away something real over what she called emotional complexity that most mature adults could work through with proper communication and professional counseling. Kayla argued that Savannah had never physically cheated, that emotional connections were more nuanced than I was willing to acknowledge, and that my black and white thinking about relationships was unrealistic in an age where people maintained complex social networks that included former romantic partners. I stepped off the treadmill and calmly explained that emotional infidelity was still infidelity, that maintaining secret communications while hiding meaningful relationships was still deception, and that my standards for exclusive commitment weren't unreasonable demands but basic expectations that any healthy relationship required as a foundation. The conversation grew more heated when Kayla suggested that I was being controlling and possessive, that my systematic documentation of Savannah's communications showed an unhealthy need to monitor and police her social interactions rather than trust her to manage her own relationships appropriately. I responded by pointing out that I'd only investigated after discovering evidence of deception, that trust had to be earned and maintained rather than blindly given regardless of behavior, and that Savannah had forfeited any expectation of privacy the moment she'd chosen to lie about her ongoing emotional connection to Derek. The most persistent harassment came from Savannah's father, who called me multiple times over the following weeks, initially trying to appeal to my sense of compassion and understanding, then gradually becoming more demanding and accusatory when I refused to reconsider my decision. He was a traditional man who believed that relationships required work and forgiveness, and he couldn't understand why I wasn't willing to fight for someone I'd supposedly loved enough to consider marrying someday. During one particularly long conversation, he told me that Savannah had always been confused about relationships, that she'd never learned how to handle multiple emotional connections appropriately, and that with proper guidance she could develop the maturity to be the partner I deserved. I found his characterization revealing. He was essentially admitting that his daughter lacked the emotional development necessary for exclusive adult relationships while simultaneously asking me to accept responsibility for teaching her how to be faithful and honest, as if those were skills that needed to be learned rather than basic character traits that should already exist. Her mother took a different approach, posting passive-aggressive content on social media about forgiveness and second chances, sharing inspirational quotes about not throwing away love over pride, and making subtle references to young people who didn't understand the value of working through difficult periods in relationships. I blocked her accounts after the third week of indirect messaging, but mutual friends kept me informed about her ongoing campaign to portray me as cold and unforgiving, someone who'd abandoned a good woman over minor relationship complications that could have been resolved with maturity and communication. The situation escalated when Derek himself reached out through LinkedIn, claiming he wanted to apologize for the drunk message that had caused problems between Savannah and me. His message was carefully crafted to sound remorseful and responsible, explaining that he'd been going through a difficult period and had reached out inappropriately, that he never intended to damage our relationship, and that he hoped I could find it in my heart to forgive both him and Savannah for the confusion his poor judgment had created. I could see immediately that this was a coordinated effort. Derek's message arrived the same day as particularly intense calls from Emma and Kayla, and the language he used echoed themes that Savannah's family had been pushing about forgiveness and second chances. Instead of responding to Derek directly, I forwarded his message to Emma, Kayla, and both of Savannah's parents, along with screenshots that showed the timeline of his communications with Savannah, demonstrating that his drunk confession hadn't been an isolated incident but part of an ongoing pattern of emotional connection that had been maintained throughout our entire relationship. The evidence showed that Derek hadn't just randomly reached out in a moment of weakness. He'd been in regular contact with Savannah for months, discussing their shared memories and maintaining the kind of emotional intimacy that kept their connection alive even while she was supposedly building something exclusive with me. I accompanied the screenshots with a brief message explaining that I wasn't interested in anyone's apologies or promises to change, that the issue wasn't Derek's inappropriate text but Savannah's decision to maintain backup relationships while pretending to be fully committed to our future together. Within a week, the harassment from Savannah's family stopped completely, and I realized that seeing the full scope of her deception had finally made them understand that this wasn't about my inability to forgive minor mistakes but about her fundamental dishonesty and emotional unavailability that had made our entire relationship a carefully maintained illusion. The situation reached its breaking point 3 weeks after Savannah moved out, when her family decided to escalate from private pressure to public confrontation by staging what they called an intervention at Franklin Barbecue, a popular restaurant in downtown Austin where I was having dinner with colleagues from the refinery. I was sitting with my supervisor Tom Martinez and 2 other engineers, discussing a project timeline over brisket and beer, when I noticed Emma and Kayla enter the restaurant and scan the dining area until they spotted me at our corner table. They were followed by Savannah's mother, Patricia, who looked like she was preparing for battle, and all 3 women approached our table with the kind of determined coordination that suggested they'd planned this confrontation carefully, timing it for maximum public pressure and hoping to catch me off guard in front of professional colleagues who might influence my willingness to engage. Emma spoke first, apologizing to my coworkers for interrupting but explaining that they needed to have an urgent conversation with me about a family matter that couldn't wait for a more private moment. Tom and the others looked uncomfortable and offered to give us privacy, but I told them to stay seated and finish their dinner, that whatever Savannah's family wanted to say could be said in front of witnesses who might actually benefit from hearing the truth about emotional infidelity and the consequences of maintaining backup relationships. Patricia took over then, launching into a prepared speech about forgiveness and second chances, about how young people make mistakes that shouldn't define their entire futures, and about how throwing away 2 years of relationship over what she characterized as poor communication and emotional confusion was wasteful and cruel. She spoke loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, clearly hoping that public pressure and embarrassment would force me to appear reasonable and open to reconciliation, but I remained calm and asked her to explain exactly what mistakes she thought Savannah had made that deserved forgiveness. The question seemed to catch her off guard because she'd apparently expected me to be defensive about my decision rather than willing to discuss the specifics of Savannah's behavior in front of strangers, but Kayla jumped in to argue that emotional connections were complicated and that maintaining friendships with former partners was normal and healthy behavior that didn't constitute betrayal or infidelity. I responded by asking whether they thought hiding those connections while lying about their significance was also normal and healthy, whether they believed that keeping promise rings from secret relationships was standard friendship behavior, and whether they thought emotional intimacy with backup options while planning a future with someone else represented the kind of character they'd want their own partners to demonstrate. The conversation grew more heated when Emma suggested that I was being unreasonably rigid in my expectations, that modern relationships required more flexibility and understanding than previous generations had needed, and that my black and white thinking about emotional boundaries showed an inability to adapt to contemporary dating realities. I calmly explained that there was nothing contemporary about dishonesty, that emotional infidelity had always been infidelity regardless of technological advances that made it easier to maintain secret connections, and that my expectations for exclusive commitment weren't outdated demands but basic relationship standards that any mature adult should understand and respect. Patricia then played what she clearly thought was her strongest card, telling me that Savannah was prepared to cut contact with Derek permanently, delete all social media accounts that might tempt her to maintain inappropriate connections, and undergo couples counseling to learn how to manage her emotions and communicate more effectively about her needs and boundaries. I found her offer revealing because it demonstrated that even Savannah's own family understood that her behavior had been inappropriate and damaging, but they still expected me to accept responsibility for fixing someone who had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of exclusive commitment for our entire relationship. The confrontation reached its climax when Patricia asked me point-blank whether I thought I was perfect, whether I'd never made mistakes that required forgiveness, and whether I was prepared to throw away someone who genuinely loved me over pride and stubbornness that prevented me from accepting human imperfection. I stood up from our table then, looking directly at her while my colleagues watched this family drama unfold, and told her that this wasn't about perfection or forgiveness but about basic honesty and respect, that I hadn't thrown away someone who loved me but had simply stopped accepting treatment from someone who had never actually chosen me as their first and only option. That's when Savannah herself appeared, emerging from wherever she'd been waiting and approaching our table with tears already streaming down her face, clearly having planned this dramatic entrance as the emotional climax of their coordinated intervention strategy. She looked directly at me and asked whether I could honestly say that our 2 years together had meant nothing to me, whether I could walk away from everything we'd built without giving her a chance to prove that her feelings for me were real and that her confusion about Derek had been a temporary lapse in judgment rather than evidence of her fundamental inability to commit exclusively. I felt every eye in the restaurant on us as she continued, explaining that she'd been young and stupid when she'd maintained contact with Derek, that she'd never intended to hurt me or deceive me, and that losing me had made her realize that what we had was more real and valuable than any fantasy connection she'd maintained with her past. The entire scene was clearly designed to put maximum pressure on me to appear compassionate and forgiving in front of witnesses, but I remained calm and asked her the same question I'd asked when Derek's text first appeared, whether she could honestly say she was ready to choose me completely, without reservation or backup options or emotional hedging that kept other doors open for future possibilities. The silence that followed my question was deafening, and I could see Savannah struggling to find words that would satisfy both her need to win me back and her inability to completely commit to exclusive emotional investment. When she finally responded that love didn't have to be simple or exclusive, that mature relationships could accommodate complexity and nuance that allowed for multiple emotional connections as long as the primary partnership remained the priority, I realized that even this public confrontation and emotional plea hadn't changed her fundamental misunderstanding of what exclusive commitment actually meant. A customer at a nearby table had started recording the confrontation on their phone, apparently recognizing good drama when they saw it, and I could see that this entire situation was about to become social media content that would follow all of us for months if I didn't end it definitively. I told Savannah and her family that they'd answered my question perfectly by demonstrating that even after weeks of supposed reflection and growth, they still didn't understand the difference between exclusive commitment and emotional portfolio management, and that their willingness to stage public confrontations rather than accept my decision showed exactly the kind of manipulative behavior that had made our relationship unsustainable from the beginning. 6 months after the restaurant confrontation, I learned the truth about Savannah's situation through an unexpected source during our company's annual barbecue at Zilker Park in Austin. I was manning the grill with some colleagues when Jake Rodriguez, a mutual friend who worked in marketing for a tech company downtown, approached me with information he thought I needed to hear about what had really been happening behind the scenes of my relationship with Savannah. Jake had been dating one of Savannah's coworkers at the fitness center, and through that connection he'd learned details about Derek's situation that put everything in a completely different perspective than what I'd understood from the drunk text and Savannah's tearful confessions. According to Jake's girlfriend, Derek had been stationed overseas with the military for the past 18 months, which explained why his communication with Savannah had been limited to social media and occasional calls rather than in-person meetings that might have forced her to choose between us definitively. The timeline Jake described was damning. Derek had been planning to return to Texas permanently for months, and his drunk text hadn't been a moment of weakness or inappropriate reaching out, but rather part of ongoing discussions about rekindling their relationship once he finished his deployment and could offer her the stability and commitment she'd been waiting for. Even more devastating was learning that Savannah had been planning to break up with me anyway, that I'd essentially been serving as emotional and financial support while she waited for Derek to become available and ready to settle down with her permanently. Jake explained that his girlfriend had overheard conversations where Savannah described me as a placeholder boyfriend, someone stable and reliable who could provide companionship and help with expenses while she waited for her real relationship to become viable again. The fitness center staff had apparently known about Derek for months, had seen Savannah's face light up whenever she received messages from him, and had watched her plan her future around his return while maintaining the pretense of building something long-term with me. Jake seemed genuinely uncomfortable sharing this information, but he felt I deserved to know that my suspicions about emotional infidelity had actually been much worse than I'd realized. Savannah hadn't just been confused about her feelings or maintaining inappropriate friendships. She'd been actively planning to leave me for someone else while using my resources and emotional investment to sustain herself during the waiting period. The revelation that I'd been a placeholder rather than a genuine partner was both crushing and liberating, because it explained so many aspects of our relationship that had never quite made sense: her reluctance to make concrete future plans, her tendency to deflect conversations about marriage or moving in together permanently, and her general emotional distance that I'd attributed to her independent personality rather than her divided loyalty and secret timeline. I realized that Derek's drunk text hadn't ruined a good relationship by introducing outside complications, but had actually saved me from continuing to invest in someone who had never intended to choose me as anything more than a temporary convenience until her preferred option became available. 3 weeks later, I learned through the same network that Savannah and Derek had indeed gotten together officially within days of my discovering their communications, confirming that their rekindled relationship had been planned and coordinated rather than a spontaneous reaction to our breakup. The speed of their reunion made it clear that they'd been emotionally involved throughout my entire relationship with Savannah, that Derek's military deployment had been the only obstacle preventing them from being together officially, and that his return had simply triggered the end of her need to maintain our relationship as cover for her real emotional investment. Learning this information was initially painful because it meant that our entire 2-year relationship had been built on a foundation of deception that was even more systematic and calculating than I'd suspected, but it also provided clarity about why Savannah's family had been so desperate to change my mind during their intervention attempts. They'd known about Derek's timeline, had understood that Savannah was planning to leave me regardless, and their pressure campaign had been motivated by guilt about their daughter's behavior rather than genuine belief that our relationship was worth saving. Emma later contacted me directly, apparently struggling with her conscience about the role she'd played in supporting Savannah's deception, and she confirmed that the family had known about Derek's return plans but had hoped that Savannah would develop genuine feelings for me that might change her priorities before she had to choose definitively. Emma admitted that she'd watched her sister use me for financial and emotional support while maintaining her real relationship in secret, and that the family's intervention attempts had been motivated more by shame about Savannah's character than by actual belief that we belonged together. I began seeing a therapist around this time, not because I was devastated by the loss of Savannah but because I needed to process the reality that I'd been systematically deceived for 2 years by someone I trusted completely, and I wanted to develop better skills for recognizing emotional unavailability and manipulation in future relationships. Dr. Sarah Chen was a psychologist who specialized in relationship trauma and recovery, and she helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't just infidelity but a form of emotional abuse that involved using my genuine investment to subsidize someone else's fantasy while denying me the information necessary to make informed decisions about my own life. Through therapy, I learned to recognize the patterns of behavior that should have alerted me to Savannah's divided loyalties, the way she'd managed conversations about our future, her reluctance to integrate our social circles completely, and her general emotional distance that I'd mistakenly attributed to independence rather than unavailability. I also started dating again, beginning with casual coffee meetings and gradually building connections with women who demonstrated the kind of emotional availability and honesty that I'd learned to value through my experience with Savannah's deception. That's when I met Claire Thompson, a marine biologist who worked for the State Environmental Agency and who approached relationships with the same scientific rigor and intellectual honesty that I appreciated in my engineering work. Claire was refreshingly direct about her intentions and expectations, never leaving me guessing about her level of interest or commitment, and she appreciated my systematic approach to building trust and emotional intimacy that Savannah had found suffocating and controlling. 18 months after the breakup with Savannah, my life had transformed in ways that made me grateful for the painful lesson in recognizing emotional unavailability and deception that ultimately led me to something infinitely better. Claire and I had been dating for 8 months when we decided to move in together, choosing a house in Cedar Park, a suburb northwest of Austin that offered more space and a better commute to both of our jobs while representing the kind of intentional future planning that I'd learned to value as a sign of genuine partnership. The process of house hunting with Claire revealed everything that had been missing from my relationship with Savannah. Claire was excited about making concrete plans together, enthusiastic about discussing mortgage terms and neighborhood schools even though we weren't planning kids immediately, and genuinely invested in building something that reflected both of our priorities and values rather than treating our relationship as a temporary convenience while waiting for something better to come. Through weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Chen, I'd processed the betrayal and manipulation I'd experienced with Savannah, learning to recognize the subtle signs of emotional unavailability that I'd missed during our 2 years together and developing stronger boundaries around the kind of behavior I would and wouldn't accept from romantic partners. Dr. Chen helped me understand that my systematic approach to relationships wasn't controlling or obsessive but represented healthy planning and investment that deserved to be matched by someone equally committed to building something real together. I'd learned to identify red flags like reluctance to make future plans, emotional distance disguised as independence, and the kind of careful ambiguity that people use when they want to keep their options open while maintaining plausible deniability about their true intentions. Claire represented everything I'd learned to value through my painful experience with deception. She was emotionally available without being needy, direct about her feelings without being dramatic, and genuinely excited about the methodical approach to building trust and intimacy that had made Savannah feel trapped and suffocated. When I told Claire about my previous relationship and why it had ended, she listened without judgment but made it clear that emotional infidelity and backup relationships were deal breakers for her as well, that she'd rather be alone than with someone who couldn't commit exclusively to building something together. Claire's approach to conflict resolution was particularly refreshing after years of Savannah's manipulation tactics and emotional volatility. When we disagreed about something, Claire addressed issues directly and honestly, working toward solutions rather than using tears or guilt trips or threats to get her way. She never made me feel like my expectations for honesty and loyalty were unreasonable demands, never suggested that modern relationships required tolerance for emotional ambiguity or backup options, and never treated my desire for exclusive commitment as possessive or controlling behavior that needed to be managed or accommodated. The contrast between Claire's straightforward communication style and Savannah's careful emotional manipulation was stark enough that I wondered how I'd ever tolerated the constant uncertainty and second-guessing that had characterized my previous relationship. With Claire, I never found myself analyzing text messages for hidden meanings, never discovered secret communications with former partners, and never felt like I was competing for attention or priority with fantasy relationships that existed parallel to our real one. Our relationship progressed at a natural pace that felt comfortable for both of us, without the artificial acceleration or strategic delays that I now recognized as signs of emotional manipulation designed to maintain control while avoiding genuine commitment. 6 months after moving in together, I proposed to Claire during a hiking trip to Hamilton Pool, choosing a moment that felt natural and right rather than orchestrating some elaborate public display designed to create pressure or drama. Claire's response was characteristically direct and genuine. She said yes immediately, then spent the rest of our hike discussing practical considerations like wedding timing and guest lists, demonstrating the kind of enthusiastic future planning that showed me she was as invested in building something real together as I was. The engagement process with Claire was everything my relationship with Savannah had never been: collaborative, exciting, and focused on creating something that reflected both of our values and priorities rather than managing competing loyalties or hidden agendas that might complicate our future together. Planning our wedding became an exercise in teamwork and shared decision-making that strengthened our partnership rather than creating stress or conflict, and I found myself genuinely excited about the future we were building together rather than constantly worried about whether my investment was being matched by someone equally committed to exclusive partnership. Through therapy and my relationship with Claire, I'd learned to recognize and value the difference between someone who chooses you completely and someone who keeps you as an option while pursuing their real preferences, and I'd developed the confidence to expect and demand the kind of emotional honesty and availability that makes genuine intimacy possible. The healing process had taught me that the right person wouldn't find my desire for exclusive commitment suffocating or unreasonable, wouldn't need to be convinced to prioritize our relationship above backup options, and wouldn't treat my systematic approach to building trust as controlling behavior that needed to be managed or circumvented through deception. 2 years after discovering Derek's text and ending my relationship with Savannah, Claire and I were celebrating our engagement at the Driscoll Hotel in downtown Austin, a beautiful venue that represented everything I'd learned to value about building something real with someone who actually wanted to be there. The party was intimate but meaningful, filled with family and friends who'd watched me recover from emotional manipulation and find genuine partnership with someone who appreciated rather than resented my commitment to honesty and exclusive loyalty. I was talking with my parents and Claire's colleagues from the environmental agency when I noticed a familiar figure approaching across the hotel's elegant lobby, Savannah, dressed in what was clearly her most expensive outfit, looking like she'd spent considerable time preparing for this moment. She walked directly toward our group with the kind of determined confidence that suggested she'd been planning this confrontation since learning about our engagement through mutual connections in Austin's social circles. Claire noticed my expression change and followed my gaze, immediately understanding who this must be without needing any explanation, then smoothly excused herself to greet other guests while giving me space to handle whatever drama was about to unfold. Savannah approached with a carefully practiced speech about realizing her mistakes and understanding now what she'd lost when she'd chosen emotional confusion over genuine love, explaining that her relationship with Derek had ended badly after 6 months when she discovered that he was just as emotionally unavailable and commitment-phobic as she'd been during our time together. She told me that Derek had used her the same way she'd used me, maintaining other connections while pretending to be invested in building something exclusive with her, and that experiencing that betrayal had made her understand how much damage she'd caused by treating our relationship as a backup option while pursuing her fantasy connection with someone who'd never actually chosen her definitively. Her confession was clearly intended to demonstrate growth and self-awareness that might make me reconsider my decision, but I found myself listening with the detached interest of someone watching a case study in consequences rather than feeling any desire to reconnect with someone who'd proven herself capable of systematic deception and emotional manipulation. Savannah continued by explaining that she'd spent months in therapy working on her commitment issues and learning to recognize her patterns of keeping backup relationships as a form of emotional insurance against vulnerability and rejection. She claimed to have developed genuine insight into why exclusive partnership required complete emotional investment rather than the careful hedging and option-keeping that had characterized all of her previous relationships, including ours. The speech was well-rehearsed and probably sincere, but it arrived about 2 years too late and was directed at someone who'd already learned to recognize and value actual emotional availability through his relationship with Claire. When she finally asked whether I thought we could try again, whether there might be room in my heart for someone who'd finally learned to choose completely and exclusively, I felt genuinely sorry for her while simultaneously feeling grateful that her betrayal had led me to someone infinitely better suited for genuine partnership. Just as I was formulating a response that would be honest but not cruel, Claire appeared beside me, sliding her hand into mine with the kind of natural intimacy that comes from secure attachment and genuine mutual choice. Claire introduced herself warmly to Savannah, acknowledging that she'd heard about their history and expressing genuine hope that Savannah was finding happiness and healing after what sounded like a difficult period of personal growth and relationship challenges. The contrast between Claire's secure confidence and Savannah's desperate manipulation was immediately apparent to everyone watching, and I could see Savannah processing the reality that I hadn't just moved on but had found someone who represented everything she'd never been able to offer: emotional availability, genuine enthusiasm for exclusive partnership, and the kind of straightforward honesty that makes manipulation unnecessary and unthinkable. I told Savannah that I was grateful she'd taught me to recognize what love wasn't, that her deception had ultimately led me to understand what genuine partnership actually looked like, and that Claire had shown me the difference between someone who chooses you completely and someone who keeps you as an option while pursuing their real preferences. Savannah's face went through several expressions as she processed my words: disappointment, anger, and finally a kind of resigned understanding that her opportunity for redemption had expired long before she'd developed the capacity to offer what I'd needed from her originally. She congratulated us both with forced graciousness, wished us happiness together, and walked away with the dignity of someone who'd finally learned that some consequences can't be undone through therapy and personal growth, that some relationships can't be repaired once trust has been systematically destroyed through months of calculated deception. As we watched her leave, Claire squeezed my hand and commented that Savannah seemed like someone who'd learned important lessons but had learned them too late to repair the damage she'd caused, and I realized that my journey from betrayal to genuine partnership was finally complete.